With Conference Championship weekend in the books, there is still one question to be answered. Who's in? Who will be the 4 teams competing in this season's college football playoff? Well, we're going to know the answer at noon Eastern tomorrow. Until then, we can follow some experts, see what their opinion is. We can debate along with the committee. We can guess what they're going to value. But we won't know until the reveal at noon Eastern tomorrow. Until then, let the debate begin. Now, I'm sure there's many thoughts running through the committee's minds as they're debating games. I mean, comparing resumes, looking at strength of schedule, looking at strength of record, looking at what are some advantages to the teams that they're comparing. Now, some think that it's going to be a battle of who is number 4 between Notre Dame and Texas A&M. Others think that maybe Ohio State, only playing 6 games this season, maybe they're not necessarily deserving of being in that top 4 and getting to play a shortened schedule. Others think that maybe Oklahoma or Cincinnati, they could make a surprise run in that top 4. Whether there's 4 teams fighting for one potential spot, 2 teams fighting for one potential spot, or even 4 to 5 teams fighting for 2 spots, each of these teams, they have legitimate arguments. There's pros and cons to each of them. So let's go over some resumes. But first, I want to go over the obvious. It's pretty clear that Alabama will be number 1. They'll be the 1 seed. They have convincing wins over Texas A&M, Georgia, Auburn, and Florida. Even though Auburn's not in the top 25 right now, they've been in and out of the top 25 throughout the season. So really, I feel you got to value these wins when you're a ranked opponent. I mean, when you beat these teams ranked, that's really huge, especially even if they don't win a game after that. It just shows that maybe it could be a season breaker for that team that you beat. So when you look at it, Alabama, they do have 3 wins against current top 10 teams right now. A&M is on the outside looking in right now. Georgia, convincing win right now in the top 10, and Florida in the top 10. Even though many say that this score in the SEC title game, it was a lot more of a dominant performance than the scoreboard shows, because many think that the officials, they were trying to keep Florida in the game. But either way, Alabama, the number 1 seed, best resume out there. And the next thing that's obvious is Clemson being number 2. Now, when you take out these 2 games that Trevor Lawrence wasn't playing, absolute dominant performances, including a win against Miami when they were number 7. And even though Miami, they're not in the top 10 at this moment, and even though they got their last game of the season canceled, I still think you got to value that. You got to value that as a top 10 win. And Clemson in the regular season, they lost their only other ranked game to Notre Dame, but this was when Clemson was missing a lot more than Trevor Lawrence. And I did say in the beginning that with the committee choosing Clemson to be number 3 over Ohio State, when you put a 1-loss Clemson team over an undefeated Ohio State, I think that could show to me, and it could prove that maybe the committee, they think that if Trevor Lawrence was able to play in that game, and if Clemson was at their full strength, that they beat Notre Dame pretty handily in that game. And I definitely think that's the reason why Clemson's been number 3 this whole time and not Ohio State. Because I remember that the committee, they did say that they were going to evaluate player availability in these games. Since we're in these really complicated times and where everything is unpredictable. So I think it just shows with their action that maybe they think if Clemson was at their full strength, they'd dominate this game in this matchup on November 7th. But they did avenge that 1 loss to Notre Dame in the ACC Championship game, and they won very convincingly. They won by 24. So Clemson, they nullify their loss. That makes the loss null and void. They're going to be the 2 seed. The question is, what will happen with Notre Dame? Are they still in it? Or are they going to be the ones getting the short end of the stick this season? But now it really comes the controversy. Who's in? Now, there are legitimate arguments for every single team. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to start off with Oklahoma's resume. Now, right away, a disadvantage, the loss against Kansas State. A game where they probably should have won. A game where they had a big lead in the second half and they blew it. And then it gets worse. The next week going on the road against Iowa State and losing by 7. Although here's where the season gets better for Oklahoma. A win against Texas, number 22 Texas, in quadruple overtime. And Texas right now is ranked 20th. So Texas is a top 20 team. And it gets even better. Ever since this 4 overtime game, not once did the Sooners give up more than 28 points. And they picked up a convincing win against Oklahoma State in Bedlam. Oklahoma State was number 14. And then they got to avenge their one of their 2 losses of the season against Iowa State. So when you look at that, that's a pro for Oklahoma right now, is they got to avenge one of their 2 losses. So now does the committee value that they only have technically lost to one team? Because Oklahoma, they have 3 wins. Right now Texas is 20, Oklahoma State is 21, and Iowa State is 6, but the question is, how far will Iowa State fall back? Will they still be in the top 10? I'd say possibly, with Florida at number 7 losing. I think they'll stay in that top 10. So if you look at it, Oklahoma's got a win against a top 10 team. They've got 2 other wins against top 25 opponents. So that is a plus. But overall, I think that loss against Kansas State is going to cost Oklahoma a spot when the committee looks at these resumes, if they haven't looked at it already. But any other season, I think this could be a legitimate argument to be in that top 4. Now I want to look at Cincinnati's resume. Now, it doesn't look the best. In fact, a group of 5 team, many think that this could be the year where it should be the year where they finally get their shot. But let's just look at their resume here for Cincinnati. A win against Army when Army was 22nd. They adapted to stopping the triple option. Now, Army, they had an opportunity, or they could have had an opportunity, to make this win a lot better by playing and beating BYU. And unfortunately, that game did get canceled. So that's unfortunate that Army couldn't kind of build on that resume that they had themselves to make this win a lot better for Cincinnati. Although they do have convincing wins against SMU and Memphis. Even though Memphis isn't a top 25 team, Memphis is still a pretty good offense. And when you're holding 2 of these high-powered offenses in SMU and going on the road to SMU, I know that road games this year, and they kind of seem irrelevant with limited to no fan attendance. I still think that's huge. I still think holding an offense like that to only 13 points per game, to 13 points in this game, huge. And then only allowing 10 against Memphis, and then going on the road to beating UCF, a team that was in the top 25 at one point in the season, and they picked up a win against 23 Tulsa, 27-24. Now, when you look at it, Cincinnati beat 3 teams when they were ranked. And unfortunately, Cincinnati, they couldn't get their opportunity to beat Tulsa twice in back-to-back weeks. But Cincinnati and Oklahoma, they have one thing in common. An advantage for them, conference champions. They have a conference championship. Something that Notre Dame doesn't have, and something that Texas A&M doesn't have. Another advantage, Cincinnati, they played more games than Ohio State. But with Ohio State being in a Power 5 conference and Cincinnati being a Group of 5 team, I just feel like they'll probably be like maybe 7th, or maybe they could be maybe 6th. It really depends. But really not a bad resume for Cincinnati to be a Group of 5 team. I feel like that's not bad at all. Now I want to get into Ohio State's schedule. Now, this resume, it probably doesn't look the best. I mean, the win against Nebraska in the opener, although many Nebraska fans, they really complained all throughout this game about the officials contributing to like 21 or 28 of those points. And then Nebraska fans, they also got mad at Ohio State for running up the score in the last minute just to get another touchdown. And many Nebraska fans, they were all, this game was a lot closer than the scoreboard says. And then the next they go on the road against Penn State, although maybe not as relevant this year, but any other year, that's a very good win. With the Big Ten not allowing fans at their games this season, maybe not as relevant this year as it has been in years past. But still, Penn State was 18 at the time. Penn State, they were trying to bounce back from a loss against Indiana, and then they beat Indiana a few weeks later, only winning by 7 in a game they probably should have won by a lot more, a game they almost gave away. But then they get a third win against an opponent in the top 25 and they're ranked. So Indiana Northwestern, they have, if I had to guess, probably 2 wins against top 17 opponents. Although Ohio State, they didn't play that well until the fourth quarter. They were carried by Trey Sermon, who set a Big Ten Championship Game record in rushing yards. Even though, me personally, I probably wouldn't feel right about giving a 6-win team a chance to compete in the national championship, because I feel like if you let one team in with only 6 wins, I feel like you got to give everybody else that opportunity. So I'm talking like you've got to probably give Ball State that opportunity for winning a conference championship and only winning 6 games. You got to give San Jose State that same treatment. You've got to give Coastal Carolina that same treatment. So that's really the one thing. I mean, I'm not on the committee, and if I was, I probably would argue Ohio's still only playing 6 games. I feel like you got to have that same energy for the other teams that have only won 6 games. But still, got to respect the schedule that Ohio State has. I know that you can only play what's in front of you, and they did that, and they won all their games that they played, even though it was only 6. But moving on to Notre Dame's schedule here, and they have a Trevor Lawrence-less and a lot of other big-time players for Clemson in the double overtime win where they were missing. So, and they ended up getting blown out in the Clemson revenge game in that rematch. So, how does the committee feel about that? As I said a moment ago, I've been saying from the beginning, I think with Clemson being 3 this whole time and not Ohio State, I think it just shows that the committee values that one loss against Notre Dame because of what they were saying. They were going to value the player availability. And that includes not playing against Trevor Lawrence in that first game. So they do have a win against North Carolina, a team that I feel like is probably going to end up in that top 15 maybe. So they will have that, and they'll have this win against the Trevor Lawrence-less Clemson Tigers. But we'll see tomorrow. And finally, Texas A&M's resume. Now, the one thing that is really going to really hurt A&M here is the one loss to Alabama. 52-24, 28-point loss. But ever since they lost to Alabama, many teams when they play Alabama, they just give up on their season. They feel like they're broken down a little bit. But A&M, they just got right back up, and they were dominant against everybody they played. They picked up a win against Florida, even though it was only by 3 points. Florida was number 4 at the time, and I think that Florida will stay in the top 10 once this final ranking comes out. So if Florida stays in that top 10, I think that really helps A&M here. Even though Florida's a 3-loss team, many people think they're overrated. But Florida's 3 losses are by a combined 12 points. So I think Florida's going to stay in the top 10 in this final ranking. So that would be huge for A&M if Florida stayed in the top 10. Then they dominated against Mississippi State, although it doesn't really look the best, at least score-wise, but their defense has been pretty dominant in really all these games except for Arkansas. Although Arkansas, not really that bad of a team. Arkansas, they probably should have maybe 1 or 2 more wins than what they do. Being dominant against South Carolina. And then they couldn't play against Tennessee the first time. They couldn't play against Ole Miss. The Ole Miss game gets canceled this season. And only winning 27 against LSU. I mean, that may not look the best, but still a dominant defensive performance. A&M had LSU pretty much shut out until that final minute of the game. Then they're dominant against Auburn in the fourth quarter, and that's a road game, which I know maybe not as relevant, but still, they had somewhat of a fan attendance there in Jordan-Hare that day. And then dominant against Tennessee in their final game of the season. So when you look at it, I feel like maybe this could be what could get A&M in is where Florida is going to stand in this final ranking. Now, one other thing that maybe some people that don't want to see A&M in the playoff, they're going to talk about this really struggled win against Vanderbilt 17-12. Now, let's not act like that A&M is the only team in question that has a close win like this. Because if you look back, Notre Dame only beat Louisville 12-7. So let's not act like Texas A&M is the only team that has a really lopsided win like that. Like a really negative lopsided win. Because Notre Dame has one of those against Louisville. So, if you want my opinion, my top 4 would be Alabama, of course, Clemson. Me personally, I would want to put A&M in that top 4, along with either Oklahoma or Cincinnati. I mean, maybe Cincinnati, although they may be more deserving. I feel like I'd put Oklahoma in over Cincinnati, because I feel like head-to-head right now, Oklahoma would beat Cincinnati. Because I just can't value a team that only plays 6 games, despite the resume. I just can't. I gotta put some more respect on the teams that play more of the games. I feel like, well, what if A&M would have just decided, well, we're just going to cancel the Alabama game ourselves. And then this loss just completely disappears from the resume. Then what? Then you're looking at an undefeated A&M team with a win against Florida. So, comment your top 4 down below, like, share, and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time.